Jesus and John the Baptist, separating fact from fiction. The origins of early Christianity are often viewed through a single lens, focusing strictly on Jesus of Nazareth. However, modern historical scholarship suggests that if we look closely at the ripples of historical memory, the true catalyst of this movement was not initially Jesus, but John the Baptizer. For centuries, theological overlays have presented a clean, fictional narrative. John was merely the humble opening act who announced Jesus and stepped aside. But when we separate theology from history, an entirely different relationship emerges. One where Jesus began as a dedicated disciple within John's widespread, politically explosive, and highly mystical movement. The historical starting point, John's movement first. In reconstructing the history of first-century Judea and Galilee, chronology matters. Long before Jesus gathered his own followers, John the Baptist was a dominant, center-stage religious figure, drawing massive public attention. Rather than working within the established Judean temple system, John operated a competing, quasi-priestly movement centered in the wilderness and the Jordan River. He offered an alternative method for the forgiveness of sins through baptism. Historically, Jesus did not invent this radical framework. He entered it. The progression of this historical relationship began with the initial catalyst movement, which was John the Baptist's mission centered on alternative forgiveness and baptism. From there, Jesus entered the movement as a dedicated disciple and underwent John's baptism. A major turning point occurred when Herod Antipas executed John by beheading him. Following this crisis, the movement underwent a phase of regrouping and continuing, where Jesus stepped forward to take up the mantle of the movement. The fiction of the smooth transition, the embarrassment of baptism. New Testament authors faced a severe historical challenge when writing their accounts. Jesus had been baptized by John. In the ancient world, undergoing baptism from a teacher implied subordination and discipleship. Scholars trace a clear theological discomfort across the Gospels as the writers tried to spin this fact. Mark's Gospel, the earliest source, records the baptism plainly without explicit theological discomfort. Matthew's Gospel introduces an objection, with John protesting that he is the one who needs to be baptized by Jesus. Luke's Gospel avoids depicting the actual baptism scene directly, mentioning it only in passing after John is already locked up in prison. John's Gospel omits the baptism entirely, replacing it with John proclaiming Jesus as the Lamb of God. This historical tension, known as the criterion of embarrassment, proves that early Christian writers could not simply erase the reality that Jesus began his spiritual journey under John's authority. Fact: the revolutionary nature of John's baptism. A common historical misconception is that John's baptism was a standard Jewish ritual bath, or mikvah. While standard ritual purity immersions were self-administered and performed routinely to handle physical impurities, John's ritual was vastly different. The direct confrontation with the temple economy offered full forgiveness of sins out in the Jordan wilderness. John directly undermined the religious authority, priestly monopoly, and sacrificial revenues of the Jerusalem temple. Rumors even circulated that Jerusalem authorities viewed John as a rebellious son of a priest, acting under the influence of a demon. The mystical and experiential ritual of John's baptism, unlike the rigid legal transactions, was highly experiential, featuring a vibrant, mystical component meant to transform a person's relationship with God. The repeatable rededication Christian tradition evolved baptism into a rigid, once-and-for-all event, which subsequently struggled with how to handle post-baptismal sin. The evidence from independent traditions like the Mandaeans suggests John's original baptism could be repeated as a continual act of spiritual renewal. Fact versus fiction, continuity and the split. When evaluating the historical relationship between these two figures, it is crucial to contrast common theological assumptions with the realities uncovered by modern scholarship. First, there is a widespread theological fiction that Jesus completely broke away from John to establish a fundamentally opposite, joyful religion, often characterized as a contrast between a fasting John and a feasting Jesus. In historical fact, however, the structural core of their messages shared deep continuity, and Jesus built his ministry directly upon John's apocalyptic foundation. Second, theological narratives often suggest that John knew his exact, subordinate place from the very beginning of his life. The historical fact reveals a much more complex reality, showing that John viewed himself through intricate prophetic models, acting as a new Samuel, an Elijah, or a quasi-priestly authority figure who sought to unify competing factions. Finally, tradition often presents the transition of leadership as seamless when John died. In truth, the historical fact is that John's execution by Herod Antipas shattered the movement into competing factions. While Jesus successfully regrouped one of these factions, other groups continued to reject Jesus entirely, choosing instead to wait for someone else. The catalyst of early Christianity. The historical reality is far more compelling than the sanitized theological fiction. John the Baptist was a towering spiritual force who brought together a diverse, passionate group of seekers across Samaria, Galilee, and Judea. When Herod Antipas executed John out of political fear, Jesus did not create a new movement from scratch. Instead, as John's brilliant disciple, he stepped into the vacuum, carried forward the fiery apocalyptic call to righteousness, and reshaped the legacy of the Master who had baptized him. Without John, the historical phenomenon of Jesus of Nazareth simply would not exist.